Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you could join us this Monday morning. I'm Carol Reimers. I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Connecticut, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to our forum on voting legislation. We're honored to have two wonderful elected officials, Congressman Jim Himes and State Connecticut Senator Paul Formica. We also will have with us Judy Lehman, who's the League of Women Voters of Connecticut Public Issues Vice President, and Laura Schmitz, who is the League of Women Voters of Connecticut Voter Service Vice President, to share with you the League's perspective on many of these things. We're also we want to welcome anyone who's joining us on Facebook Live. We're very pleased as the League of Women Voters to, for over 100 years, to be empowering voters and defending democracy. And we have been here for many voting reforms that we have supported, the Voting Rights Amendment, motor voter, in Connecticut, election day registration. We have fought against voter suppression, and we monitor elections and make sure that the process is fair for all the voters in Connecticut. And we are pleased to share upcoming legislation today with you, since many of you I know are concerned about what's happening on the state and federal level. I think we're hopefully good to go. I think it's working on Facebook. So I will go ahead and introduce Congressman Himes, who represents the 4th Congressional District of Connecticut. And we're so pleased to be able to hear about some exciting federal legislation that's coming up that will really expand the franchise for many voters. Congressman Himes, would you like to start?
Thank you, Carol. I'm grateful for the opportunity to join you this morning and have this conversation. I can't imagine a time at which a discussion of our electoral system is as important as it is right now. And I'm certainly paying much more attention than I might have in years past, because I was an up close and personal witness in early January to an attempt to throw away the will of the American voters in favor of a completely unsubstantiated zero evidence claim that President Trump had in fact won the election. And we don't need to spend a lot of time on that. We all lived through it. But it's important context for the fact that though every court in the land, some 60 of them, turned aside the challenges that were based on that ruse, and though Vice President Mike Pence, when push came to shove, did the right thing in the joint session on January 6th, right before we were subjected to an insurrection, the effort to reduce the franchise, to keep Americans from voting, has, I think, never had quite as much steam, powered by the instincts, I think, that drove the insurrection on January 6th. And I'm going to try to address this in the spirit of the League of Women Voters in as nonpartisan a way as I can. But it's hard to do, quite frankly, because the threat that we see out there, and then I will turn quickly to the legislation that we're working on to address it, is an acceleration of attempts, largely in the South, pretty much exclusively in Republican states, to roll back the many mechanisms that have been put into place over time to increase the number of voters, and in particular in the South, the number of voters in communities of color. I won't go into all of, there's some 300 laws on state, proposed laws on state in state houses right now to do things like increase the amount of identification that is required. Of course, it is the elderly and communities of color and the poor who tend not to have identification. Remarkably, and this sort of gives away the game, a number of states are talking about doing away with Sunday voting. Now, Sunday voting is a long tradition in the South of souls to the polls, where in Black churches, people go after the service to vote. And, needless to say, it's not, you don't need to be too much of a detective to know what's being done when there are attempts to remove Sunday voting. Now, if there were any structural or systemic evidence that we had a problem with voter fraud, that tens of thousands or even thousands of people were committing individual voter fraud because they didn't show an ID, or because you're more likely to commit fraud if you vote by mail. By the way, we've been voting by mail for years and years and years. Some states for years have had vote by mail exclusively, like the state of Washington. If there were any evidence at all that there were individual fraud associated with any of these things, Sunday voting, early voting, after hours voting, vote by mail, we could have a policy discussion about that. But there is no evidence. And so as a consequence, we're faced with a threat to the concept that every American should have the right and accessibility to vote that is driven by partisan concerns. So very quickly, we have several pieces of legislation at the federal level. HR 1, which is designed to do a bunch of things. It's a pretty broad ranging piece of legislation. It's called For the People Act, that would actually enforce, it would remove barriers to things like expanded voting hours, early voting, other mechanisms of disenfranchisement. It would take a whack at trying to take some of the money out of the system by creating a low dollar 6-to-1 match for federal candidates, the funds to come out of judicial decisions rather than the sort of general fund taxpayer dollars. It would substantially increase the amount of disclosure that people would have to make if they are spending in the political arena. Corporations or unions or others who are running TV ads would have to very clearly say who they were. It would very explicitly forbid foreign money from inside our elections. It is criticized for its breadth, and it is broad, but at a time when we are seeing attempts in a third of the states of the union to really roll back people's ability to access the franchise, I think it's appropriate to the challenge. The second piece of legislation that I'll mention quickly is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, HR 4. This group will know that in its Supreme Court decision, Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court held that while the Voting Rights Act itself was constitutional, Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which is the section that identified those jurisdictions in which there had been a long track record of discriminatory measures put in place to try to prevent, let's just say it, Black people from voting, that those lists, that those jurisdictions were out of date. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act reemphasizes the validity of the Voting Rights Act and modernizes, if you will, the jurisdictions that would be subject to pre-clearance for changes to voting procedures that might have a discriminatory effect. I'll close just by saying, sadly, because and I really, you folks know me, I take no joy in the partisan fight. Because we do have one party that at the national level is working very hard to restrict the franchise in certain localities and amongst certain demographics, neither of these bills have bipartisan support in the Congress. That means it's going to be a real slugfest to get them passed in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. It takes us into a world of, does the filibuster survive? How does it survive? But let me just close with this point, and I know we've got Senator Formica on here. Those of us in Connecticut don't have necessarily a right to point a finger here, because, of course, in Connecticut, we're not at the forefront of making it easy for people to vote, because in our Constitution, of course, there is a there is a restriction on voting on the first Tuesday in November. So we don't get to stand in judgment here in the state of Connecticut, because we have some work to do to make sure that the franchise is extended to everybody here in the state of Connecticut as well. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity. I'll be quiet there. Carol, I think you're muted.
Yes, thank you. I apologize. We have a couple questions that we wanted to ask you. The first one was sort of in looking back at the unfortunate events on January 6th, have you found that this has changed your relationship with your colleagues in the Congress? And you mentioned the difficulty getting things passed. Do you think there's any hope that we can rise above it all, I guess, and work together?
Well, emotions are still pretty heightened. I'm not an overly emotional person, but I can still sort of access some of the fear and anxiety that existed on that day. I mean, it's I was in the chamber when it happened. I watched those guards with their weapons drawn, piling furniture in front of the door. It's something that I never imagined I would see in, Uruguay, much less in the United States of America. And so it's still hard. There's a broad array. Look, on the Republican side, there remain a small number of my Republican colleagues who are just do or die Donald Trump. They're still sort of maintaining the notion that there was massive corruption in the election. A lot of my Republican friends are in a pretty uncomfortable position. Some of them, like Adam Kinzinger and Lynn Cheney, in my opinion, did the right thing. On the Democratic side, there's a real spectrum. Some folks are still really, really angry and are saying, I'm just not going to work with these folks who, 2/3 of them signed, amicus briefs to the Supreme Court urging an overturning of the results of the election. My own view on that is that, I'm not sent to Washington to manifest my own emotions or cares. I'm sent there to get things done for my constituents. So I'm sort of on the other side of the spectrum, which is I may not approve of what you did, leading up to January 6th. But if you can help me get infrastructure money into southwestern Connecticut, I'll work with you. Look, it's a very difficult moment from a partisan standpoint, but if nothing else, I have to respect the fact that each and every one of my colleagues was sent there by a majority of the 750,000 people they represent, and they're there for me to work with to try to get things done for my constituency.
Good, thank you very much. Well, we, obviously, as a nonpartisan organization, we hope that everyone will work together to pass many of these voting reforms. Is there money in this bill for equipment? As we had emergency equipment in 2020 for the 2020 election, which really helped Connecticut meet the challenge of voting in a pandemic. And then we've had upgrades in the HAVA legislation in the past, Help America Vote Act. Could you share if there's any funding for equipment and things like that for voting?
Yeah, Carol, I think I can only answer your question about 50%. I don't think so. These are not authorization or appropriations bills, and so I think they're more about the regulation of the electoral system. So no, I don't think so. But I do know that there is bipartisan support for making sure that every jurisdiction in the country has, and this is almost, people come at this almost from a cybersecurity rather than from a, voting accessibility standpoint, which is making sure that in every single jurisdiction around the country, there is equipment which is auditable, which is modern, which is secure. So I do anticipate that even if it comes from sort of a cybersecurity angle, that the Congress will, in a bipartisan way, make funds available to those jurisdictions that need more modernized or upgraded equipment.
Okay, good. That's great to know. And then sort of the last question, and I would invite the attendees who have come into the webinar with us to ask any questions in the Q&A box. But we also wanted to know sort of what you felt as you know, our congressperson in Connecticut, what's been the most successful bipartisan legislative action that you've seen recently, and that maybe hopefully we could mirror with some of this voting legislation?
Yeah, well, so, kudos to both parties for, until last week, working together really well on COVID legislation. So the first CARES Act, which we passed about a year ago, very substantial in size, about the same size as the one that we just passed last week, had strong bipartisan support. You sort of hate to hold that up as an example because it's not, prospective, and it's not an infrastructure bill that'll bring our country into the 21st century. And I do mention that because I do hope, and I think both parties will have some work to do to make it happen. But I do hope that we can move forward in the coming months on a strong bipartisan infrastructure plan. That tends to be one of those areas where everybody agrees. And then you get to the pay for is how you pay for it. And then nobody agrees and nobody wants to talk about it, as we saw during the debate around tolling here in the state of Connecticut. But the answer to the most recent thing was a year ago, and then subsequent bills that really set the stage for, first of all, a lot of small businesses survive, a lot of people to get cash to keep their households more or less in order, and to begin to address a year ago the challenge around vaccine. So that was comforting in the sense that you knew that at least if there was a national emergency, the polarization could collapse long enough to get something very substantial done to really do some good things for the American people.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. And I know you're going to have to leave us toward the end of the hour, but let's move ahead, and maybe we can have a little more of exchange before you have to leave.
Absolutely.
I'd like to introduce State Senator Paul Formica, who represents the sort of across the state from our congressman, who represents the sort of the southwestern corner. State Senator Formica, you represent many of the towns in sort of the southeastern section. So would you like to share with us some of the voting reforms that you support in this legislative session?
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning to all of you. Good morning, Congressman. Thank you for the opportunity to sit with you this morning and talk about, this very important change in how we live and function in, today versus how we voted and lived and functioned many years ago. Times are changing, and we, as a legislature and as a federal government, have to change with the times to make sure that people have the opportunity to get and vote safely. I did look a little bit at HR 1, and the congressman is right. It's very broad. I have some concerns with it. As an example, it requires at least 15 consecutive days of early voting for federal elections, voting sites to be open. And I'm concerned about small communities like, Montville and Sprague and Lyme and Old Lyme. And, how do they staff and maintain something like that for 15 days? While I'm in favor of early voting, I think it's important to look at the ramification of some of these things and the imposition on small town budgets. And, so that's just kind of one example. There's a lot of requirements for that are overridden for states and going into the feds taking over. But that's the federal conversation, and that, as the congressman rightly pointed out, there's going to be some long conversation on that. Here in Connecticut, we have resolutions 58 and 59 that are going to address no excuse absentee ballot voting, which I fully support. I think that, as I said earlier, times have changed, and we have to change with the times. And as it's written in the Constitution, then we have to adjust it in the Constitution. So I don't have any problem with allowing no excuse absentee ballot voting. Early voting is resolution 59, something that we've seen before. The concerns I had the last time Um, you know, I still have those concerns. I think there should be, like the federal bill, like it or not, the provisions are in there on how to do it, where to do it, and why to do it. In this particular resolution, there is no description on where that early voting can take place and how that early voting can take place. And I think that's a conversation we need to have. But I am completely in favor of voting early and finding a way that we can do that. So I think there will be broad support in the state legislature for this. I'm hopeful that it does not fall on party lines, because I really think if we look in the polling before the last election, some 80% of the people in the state of Connecticut wanted early voting and wanted no excuse absentee ballot voting, and that's both parties. You know, the argument is that, you know, it's you know, the Democrats are favored in the election because it, you know, they have more people doing absentee no excuse voting than the Republicans. Well, as a Republican, as a proud Republican for, you know, an elected official for over 30 years, you know, then that's up to us to try to get people to use absentee ballot voting if we're worried about getting votes. But it's also up to us to do the right thing each and every day when we're there. And, you know, I am saddened by the actions of the, you know, the previous president. And I think he put Republicans in Connecticut in a very bad light in a lot of ways. And you know, I'm hopeful that we can move forward. You know, and really get on with the idea of doing the business we need to do to serve the people here in the state of Connecticut. And that's what I'm focusing on each and every day. So I know that we're going to have these votes. The one vote with the early voting needs a simple majority because it passed by a simple majority last time, and it needs the opportunity just to do that again. It'll be on the election. The other absentee ballot one needs, I think it's 2/3, 3/4 of the vote to get it on. And I'm confident that I think we can get the support to get that on there. So, you know, that's kind of the brief overview of what we have. I don't know if you have any questions, but, you know, I would like to invite the congressman down to the greatest district in the state, down here in the 20th district, where we have some wonderful opportunities. He can learn about the great manufacturing we have down here, the great tourism industry we have down here, and all of the great parks and shorelines and everything that we do is wonderful down here. So when you're out in Hartford, you can think about not only sending, you know, that infrastructure money to southwestern Connecticut, you can throw some to southeastern Connecticut, because I know your counterpart's been working awful hard to do the same. So, you know, we're appreciative of Congressman Courtney and his efforts. So thank you for the opportunity to join you all today.
Thank you, Senator Formica. I do actually have a couple of questions for you, and one of them you covered, which was looking forward, how could we get, you know, HR 58 and 59 passed? And it sounds like you feel that we have a good chance of seeing both of those resolutions go through this session. If I could just bring you back to that for a second.
Sure. Yeah, no, sure. I think, you know, there are some people that are going to have concerns about the integrity of the vote. In other words, no identification. People are concerned that you have to have identification and be eligible to vote. That's a valid concern. And you know, there's a lot of places that we go to that we're required to show identification, and you know, voting should not be any different. But that said, I think, you know, since this initiative was defeated at the Connecticut ballot, you know, how many years ago? And was it 2014, I think?
Yes.
You know, I think our lives have changed. COVID aside, I think our lives have changed because everything is just so much quicker, so much faster. We're on all these phones, everything is crazy. And so I think people are going to take the opportunity to want to vote, you know, by mail and vote without excuse. So COVID, of course, highlighted that. And, you know, we want to be able to make sure that people are safe. And So I think the 80% number of people wanting to for us to pass this, I think is going to be listened to, and I expect that it will pass.
Great. And one other question about New London as a city, actually, in your part of the state, had only a 55% turnout in 2020 election. We know Hartford experienced similar numbers as other places in the other places in the state tending toward the urban areas, unfortunately. Do you think there's anything we can do to improve that number? What would you recommend?
Well, I think with anything else, it starts with education, and it starts with education at a young age. I don't believe the government is in the business of forcing people to vote. There's a bill, which I think was a bit short-sighted, that came out by one of my Democrat colleagues wanting to fine people if they didn't vote. I mean, I think that's just a bit too far. It's just a bit over the edge. We are still a free country, and it's up to the people to decide if I don't believe the Secretary of State should send millions of ballots out, because there were hundreds of thousands that were not correct. The addresses weren't correct. I think it's easy enough for people to call up, get a ballot, and then provide their choice on the ballot and send it back in, especially if we do no excuse absentee ballot. I think there's no reason why we have to do it. So in terms of the cities that are showing a lower turnout, I think we start with education on civic involvement in the early grades and through high school. We encourage volunteerism and allow those kids to get out into the community and see what the effect is, and get involved in the political process. I think some of the course load and the curriculum in high schools can be altered to make sure that that people are learning, the kids are learning about civic involvement. Here in East Lyme, we have the great Roseanne Hardy, for years taught civic classes, and she was a giant in getting all of her students involved in the political process, both locally and on the state and federal level, and took them down to Washington on field trips in those days when you can. So that's just one good example of, I think, how we can broaden it out. And if we do that, then I think people will be happy to say, yeah, this is a privilege. This is something that our veterans, our armed forces, are out fighting for the right for our freedom, so that we're able to do this. And so I think with more civic awareness, I think we can encourage, and people will be happy to participate more.
Great, thank you so much. And I'd like to invite Congressman Himes to join in a little bit and maybe talk a little bit about that last question as well, about how do we elevate voting and encourage people to vote, particularly in areas where historically their vote they haven't voted, and perhaps because they don't feel that their vote is being recognized or counted as much as they would like. So Congressman Himes, do you have something you could add on that?
Yeah, I agree with what the senator said. Look, it's a lot easier to deal with accessibility than to deal with the fact that we've traditionally had, relative to other kind of Western democracies, we've had, I don't need to tell the League of Women Voters this, not particularly good levels of participation. And the senator is exactly right. I mean, there's a good conversation to be had about, should a small town have to staff a voting place for 15 days or whatever. I think that there's a reasonable conversation to be had. And look, in this era of technology and everything else, it's a lot easier to do things than it was 25 years ago, maybe requesting an absentee ballot online, that sort of thing. So I do think, that there's a good faith conversation to be had there about what's appropriate for different locales. I would hope, and we're not there today, that we're there, sort of united behind the idea, regardless of party, that we want more people rather than fewer people to vote. But it's really hard. I mean, as the senator says, he says it's education. I think that's right. It is partly education. It's also, if I can take some of the burden for those of us in elected office, a lot of people aren't participating just because they don't feel like their government is responsive to their needs. if you talk to African Americans in Bridgeport, you will hear that it just wherever I vote, it doesn't make a difference. And probably the most charitable explanation for the violence that we saw in Washington on January 6th, amongst other things, there was a group of people there who believed that government wasn't being responsive. Now, I'm not drawing a comparison between the two groups in any way, shape, or form, but my point is that a lot of Americans look at the American political dialogue and say it's toxic, it's poisonous, you can't do the basic things of governing. Why in the world would I want to participate? So the burden is on all of us. It's on people like the senator and myself to get a little uncomfortable about reaching out to the other side and maybe risk earning the wrath of your primary electorate to actually get some things done and to make some compromise. I would hope that on both sides of the aisle, more of us would understand that when we launch really tough, negative broadsides, either way, we're damaging the fabric of our democracy. It's one thing to say that, as the senator did, 15 days of voting for a small town is really tough. It's another thing to say something that, that sadly is more consistent with the national dialogue, which is, the Democrats are terrible socialists or the Republicans are, it goes on and on and on. And I just wish most of us would recognize that every time we use language like that, we're tearing at the fabric of our democracy. And then lastly, Carol, I really think that, and I keep saying this everywhere I go, at the end of the day, people like the senator and myself are going to be responsive to the incentives that are put in front of us. And the more the American public tolerates that kind of language, that the opposition is not just wrong on their ideas, but they're unpatriotic, they're evil, they're morally compromised, the more Americans tolerate that language, the more they encourage it, the more our democracy is at risk. And that's not language I ever used to use. But again, having gone through January, I use that language right now. If we celebrate, our media does it, boring guys like me don't, we're not all that interesting on the cable news shows, right? It's nuanced, it's shades of gray. They want the bomb throwers. And at the end of the day, the responsibility lies on the shoulders of the American citizenry to decide what kind of behavior you want out of your elected officials. If you want somebody who is simply making you feel good the way it feels good to be a Red Sox or a Yankee fan, deeply tribal, you'll get the government you deserve. If you want somebody who's a little boring, who sees shades of gray, who understands that compromise is the way we govern the state and the country, we might just get through.
Thank you, Congressman Himes. Senator Formica, do you have something you would like to add to this conversation?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the viewpoint of the congressman, and I couldn't agree more. A centrist is getting rarer and rarer in the political conversation because, perhaps it doesn't sell as many newspapers or generate the activity, but the percentages, the 15% on the far left and the 15 on the far right tend to be driving the conversations. And I believe it's those of us in the middle that have the responsibility to try to bring people together. And I can tell you, when I was first elected as first selectman way back when in East Lyme, I immediately went to speak to the Democrat town committee. And I think I was the first sitting selectman to speak to the other committee in 26 years. And I just said, hey guys, we're all loving this town. We all need to work together. We all want what's right. What do we really disagree on at the end of the day? A policy here and a policy there. And that set the stage for 7 years of working together, where we got some stuff done, and nobody wanted to take the credit. Nobody mattered. It was about what we could do for the people in the town of East Lyme. And I've tried to do that here in my role as a senator here in state government, because it's okay to disagree. That's what it's about. As long as we're not disagreeable when we do it, and we respect the other side, and we move forward. And I think now more than ever, after the polarization of, the last 4 years, now it's time to come together, and we need to bring the people together and say, here's what we need to do. The extreme right and the extreme left, need to come to talk to centrists like I believe Congressman Himes is, and I know that I am. so that we can say, hey, we'll give a little bit here, maybe, 15 days, for example, and could be a little excessive, but could we manage 3 or 4? Maybe. I don't know. You'd have to talk, to the people in those towns to see what they could afford. But at least there needs to be room for conversation.
Okay, we do have a question that's a little more specific. It's about a proposed legislation in Connecticut for a study of ranked choice voting. And I wondered, Senator Formica, if you could comment on your thoughts about that.
Well, I think
if you support it or not, I guess is what this question is about.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was endorsed by Sam as a result of my standing on those and these bills that we talked about. And I do support the study for ranked choice voting. I think it's another opportunity. It's the old Einstein theory. You keep doing things, the same way, expecting a different result, right? It's the definition of insanity. So I think we need to look at these new opportunities and find out how they work. Can they work in small towns? Can they work in big cities? Do they work in state and federal elections? Or how do we roll these out? And what do we need to do? So, I am a supporter of looking into that study to see how it would work.
Great. I'm sure that this is something that people are interested. And another question was about HR 1, and it has funding for clean finance reform for candidates. Senator Formica, I guess we would like you to talk about the Citizens Election Program funding for candidates in Connecticut. And Congressman Himes, can you talk a little bit more about campaign finance reform in HR 1? So I guess, I don't know who would like to start. Senator Formica, you want to talk about the Citizens Election Program in Connecticut that we have?
Sure. I'll just go quickly. I've been a participant in the Citizens Election Program since I ran for Senate back in November of 2014, and I thought, it's a really good way to do it. I think the program has been watered down since the days that it started. I think back in the Governor Rell's administration. So. I think there are improvements that we can do. But I think the concept is generally the right concept, and it looks to me that HR 1 is trying to mirror something along those lines. So, I think it's important. It opens opportunity and it removes barriers, and I think that's what we want to try to do. Look, we're having trouble volunteering everywhere, as your organization probably knows. We're having a tough time getting volunteer firemen. We're having a tough time getting volunteer for political parties, for people to help in healthcare and things. So it's time to really look at ways that we can encourage participation. And I think this campaign finance in Connecticut has done a good job doing that. And I'm sure the congressman will tell us the expectations on the federal level will be the same.
Yes, please, Congressman Himes.
Yeah, so the senator's right. The HR 1 more or less mirrors the Connecticut CEP program. It's a small dollar match in HR 1, 6-1, not using general revenue taxpayer funds. And so, I'm very supportive of that. I'm enormously jealous of my state level colleagues who, they do a little bit of low dollar fundraising, have a fundraiser or two, boom, they're done. I'm jealous because, unlike, me or the senators or a lot of my colleagues, they'll spend 3-4 hours a day raising money. That's a massive waste of time. It opens the door to people who are capable of giving more money, having more sway. That's distortive of our democracy. And so, I couldn't be more supportive. Now, the pushback comes from two different directions. One, it comes from, well, this is sort of, government subsidizing partisan activity. Okay, I suppose that's true. It subsidizes it in equal measure for the various parties. And then we run into the issue that Citizens United highlighted, which is that, the Supreme Court found that political expenditure is First Amendment protected activity. And so now we're in the world of trying to regulate it to reduce its importance rather than simply, in some way eliminating it. That's why there is talk, and this is a generational thing, but there is talk about trying to amend the Constitution to draw a distinction between political speech, which is and must be protected, and your ability to amplify your political speech with billions of dollars if you happen to have billions of dollars. It's actually a tough thing to do. If I can be fair to a decision that I disagree with, we all agree that we have the right to stand on a soapbox and espouse our political views. Well, do I have a right to buy a megaphone, for $250 to further amplify my political views? And where do the lines exist? So, but anyway, I'm getting off topic here because, yes, HR 1 does mirror what looks like a pretty successful program here in the state of Connecticut.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate both of you being able to sort of respond to these questions. I'm going to move on a little bit and give our Public Issues Vice President a chance to talk about what we're working on, and hopefully maybe you could respond to anything that she brings up as well. So Judy Lehman, would you please share with us?
Thanks, Carol, and thank you, Congressman, and thank you, Senator Formica. I will just say that we are very much in support of HR 1 and the For the People Act and HR 4, and wish you great success in your across the aisle efforts on that behalf, Congressman. And Senator Formica, I was delighted to hear you say how much you are in favor of the no excuse absentee voting referendum. And it just delights me to know that you are firmly in that, in support of it. And that you mentioned that it was a temporary reform in 2020 and that it needs to be taken out of the Constitution and legislated so that we can actually have a no excuse absentee voting system established here in Connecticut. I did want to quibble with you a bit about your selection of the word ballots, that were hundreds of thousands of absentee ballots were sent out by the Secretary of State. As I'm sure you know, she sent out absentee ballot applications and they had to be returned to the town clerk's office. And I really urge you to be careful when you talk about that, to be clear about that. And I'm also very happy that you are in support of the early voting resolution, even though you have some concerns about it. And I just want to say about both of these resolutions that we want to see passed in this legislature with enough votes so that we can vote on them as voters in 2022, that our understanding is that the legislature is not even empowered to write legislation until these amendments are passed, both first in the House and Senate, and then by the voters. And then you go about creating the actual legislation that implements these votes. And we know that in the testimony that we've heard in recent public hearings before the Government Administration and Elections Committee, we've heard strong support, for example, from the Town Clerks Association, which has testified in favor of expanded absentee voting and asked to be at the table when the legislature begins drafting this legislation. And they are professionals and should be involved in the decision-making about the statutes, the procedures and the funding and the tech upgrades that they will be called upon to use to administer our free, fair, secure and accessible elections. And likewise, the Registrars of Voters Association of Connecticut, which has taken no position on absentee ballots or early voting, does also want to be at the table to help discuss the terms of implementing these measures should they pass. So I hope we can work with you to find a way to get the no excuse absentee voting resolution passed in the legislature by a 75% margin in both the House and the Senate. So, and the early voting HJ 59 passed by at least a simple majority so that we, the voters, can have an opportunity to vote on these in 2022. Our friends and colleagues at the UConn School of Social Work's Institute for Political Social Work says that voting is a social determinant of health. And it's obvious that communities who vote are better off in important measures of well-being, and they receive more attention and resources from elected officials. We in the League of Women Voters of Connecticut believe that we have a distance to go to improve access to the ballot and voter turnout in all elections. Let's get to work and start with the legislature passing both HJ 58 and HJ 59 and get to work on the health of our democracy, because the health of our democracy and of our voters is at stake here. I also wanted to mention Senator Formica that and Congressman Himes, that I took a look at the number of absentee votes that were submitted and counted in the 5 towns represented by those of us on this webinar today. In East Lyme, it was almost 50% of the votes. It was 5,261 out of almost 12,000 that were cast and voted by absentee. And in Greenwich, it was 15, almost 16,000 out of 36,000 votes voted in Greenwich. The 5 towns here represent 6.7% of the total votes cast, 7.6% of the absentee ballots cast, and 6% of the election day registrations that were submitted and voted on in November. So we see that voter access is a really important thing to our voters everywhere, and urge your working with us to make these resolutions pass in the House and the Senate with sufficient votes, again, so that we the people can vote on these amendments to the Constitution in 2022.
Thank you, Judy. Senator Formica, do you have any comments? And Congressman Himes after him, I would hope you would add something too.
Well, I appreciate the correction. I did say ballots, and I, of course, meant applications. So thank you for that. And you're right, we all need to be more careful in what we're talking about. But I think, I think we all want, at the end of the day, the same thing. We want accessibility to the ballots. We want to make sure that it fits our lifestyle, and we want to make sure that we have people running for office that we feel confident voting for or debating against. And I think that's been the hallmark of our democracy over many years. And I would like to say I've not touched the January 6th thing. It was disgraceful. And certainly I feel horrible for all of the people that were in that room, and the fright that must have been, evident, and the fear. So it's not something that, as a Republican, we support at all. And it's disgraceful and should never have happened in our country. So I'm sorry, Congressman, that you and your colleagues had to suffer through that. So, but I agree. I'm going to work hard to try to get these resolutions passed. I don't think it's going to take a lot of work this time because of the last year or so. But we all have to watch out. And I'll continue my work with Sam, which is could be a better way and kind of a middle road on how we get things done, both in the state and in our country.
Thank you very much. Congressman Himes?
Just 2 things to add. One, just to say how much I agree with efforts to make it easier rather than harder for people to vote, and that has to do with no excuse absentee ballot. It has to do with making sure that we allocate our machines and our voting places in ways that don't ask certain geographies to wait in line for hours and hours. That's pretty hard for folks, for a lot of people. So I couldn't agree more. And then the second point I want to make, Senator Formica and I haven't worked together in past, but this is something that I think is of relevance to the League of Women Voters. We need to find ways to get more people involved in starting in our local governments, and it's so easy. If you don't want to be on the Board of Estimate Taxation and do a whole budget for a town, you can join the Shellfish Commission or, whatever. It's so easy. And the reason I say that is because I reflect on the way Senator Formica is sort of talking about these issues. And I reflect on the fact that in the Congress, the people who really are easy to work with and the folks that are willing to reach across the aisle and who are least likely to use explosive rhetoric, almost without exception, are former mayors, first selectmen, and governors. Because they used to actually have to, run fire departments and police forces and deal with zoning regs and God help us, the many controversies that arise in boards of education, that kind of thing. By contrast, the folks that haven't sort of experienced what it's like to compromise and to actually run stuff can be pretty explosive. And I think if you were to look at, the more bombastic members of both sides of the aisle, you would not find a lot of former, county officials, mayors, and governors. So God bless the League of Women Voters for trying to encourage more people into that municipal grassroots participation. Because even if the mayor of Stanford doesn't go off to run for state senate or whatever, it is really good training for what is required to get things done in a system that only works well when there is compromise.
Thank you so much. There's another sort of very Connecticut specific question about HB 6205, which I was trying to do a quick reminder of myself because, we see these numbers. I'm sure for you as elected officials, it must be awful when you just see this listing of numbers, but it talks about revising absentee ballot statutes. Is that correct, Judy? Do you know?
Yes, believe that's Senator Matt Blumenthal's law. Or legislation, and that would be a temporary statutory fix until the amendment gets passed.
Oh, okay. So I don't know if you've had any chance to look at that legislation, and I don't want to put you on the spot necessarily, but if you have had it and you have a comment, then good.
We're actually going to be talking about it at a meeting a little later today. I don't think I have any further comments right now.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just pulled it up on the computer now, and I have not seen it before, so it's probably best I don't.
Okay.
I can speak to it. Basically, it's because of the constitutional requirement to do some of the early voting and absentee ballot changes. The timetable, it would basically try to move the timetable up because of all the requirements to change the Constitution. So it's kind of like a stopgap so that we don't have to wait so long if we want to do some of these things, that we can kind of go around that. It's basically to try to get the timetable moved up from like 2024 or farther out.
All right, great. Well, I won't put you on the spot to respond since you haven't had a chance to really examine it. Thank you, Laura, for clarifying that a little bit. I know I was going to invite Laura to speak about sort of the impact on our local elections systems and our towns on the bills that are proposed. I know that I just want to take a minute. I know that Congressman Himes will have to be leaving us in a minute or two. So I didn't know if there was something you wanted to say, Congressman, before you have to go on to another meeting. Is there anything you'd like to share with us before that? Oops, I'm not hearing you.
There we go. I think I mounted my soapbox on on the topics du jour in terms of really working hard as you are for ballot accessibility, participation in local government, and really, I keep flipping back. The senator and I and all elected officials, we have our fair share of responsibility to try to guide our democracy to a less polarized place. I actually hope that we've demonstrated that this morning, and we need a lot more of that. But again, I keep flipping back responsibility for that onto the citizenry. I keep telling people, if you're spending your time staring at a Facebook page and getting increasingly enraged, I don't care which side of the aisle you're on. If you're staring at Facebook or Twitter or whatever you're staring at and getting enraged, number one, you're probably tearing at the fabric of our democracy. And number two, you may be being manipulated. You may be being manipulated by whoever out there with a lot of money to launch social media campaigns by conceivably foreign powers and stuff. So again, I just keep coming back to the notion that the future of our democracy, which I do think was slightly imperiled in January, relies on the American citizenry taking a deep breath and thinking about how they consume information, what they believe on social media, understanding that the issues that Paul and I deal with are never black and white. They're always complicated. There's always nuance. There's always shades of gray. And I don't miss an opportunity to say that, because yes, we have responsibility, no question about it. But so do the citizens of this country in terms of determining what kind of a democracy we're going to have going forward.
Thank you very much. And we really appreciate you taking the time this morning to talk about this very important voting legislation that's facing our country and our state. And I guess I know that actually Senator Formica has a busy schedule today as well, but I wanted to give him an opportunity to say some last things. And one quick question for you is whether you would co-sponsor House Resolution 58 and 59, Senator Formica.
I'd like to see the final language before I do, but I would certainly consider it. And I'm pretty sure that I'm going to do that. But I am in favor of both of those resolutions passing. And I wanted to thank the Congressman for his kind words and for his, sharing the opportunity. I've not had much contact with him. I deal with his friend and colleague, Congressman Courtney, quite often, who, I think is doing a great job. So I'm glad to be able to be on here. But yeah, we're going to try to do the best we can to get everybody to pass these resolutions and find a way to make voting easier and safer and more accessible and getting people on. And I think, thank you to the League for all that you do to encourage, really raising awareness in these very important topics. And, it's a nonpartisan effort that you're engaging in to raise awareness and getting people involved in the process. And that's what it is. And, in small towns, town meetings are packed on issues that you don't sometimes think would pack them, and not packed when you would expect them. We had a gas station that we were selling and that we were buying in East Lyme for, to develop something. And it took 30-40% of people out and, for a $600,000 purchase. But for our budget, which was 40 million, we had, 8%, 10% come out. So we have to kind of get more involvement in a lot of ways. And I think what the League is doing, and I think the efforts of the congressman and the efforts of the good senators and representatives here in Connecticut, to change our laws and to move things forward, I think is the right way to go. And my offer is still open, Congressman. You're welcome down for a visit. We'll host you and show you around our great district.
Super. Thank you so much. So now I would like to give Laura a chance to sort of talk about, which the League of Women Voters, of course, hopes that some of this legislation is passed and we get to move forward with it, and how it might impact the election process particularly in our Connecticut towns and cities. So Laura, please go ahead.
Carol, thank you, Senator Formica, for being here. And I sorry, Representative Himes had to leave. I wanted to thank him for his support of HR1 and always giving a shout out to our local elections. The local elections are coming up this fall, and it's really the best way and the easiest way to get involved. As he said, if you're tired of ranting on Facebook, if you're just tired, the way to do that and to get involved in your local community, because that's really where the big impacts are. As well as Senator from Mika has pointed out, it's a great place to start and to get to the next level if you want. And also you could be hanging out with future presidents for all you know. So I really appreciate that. Please go run for your Board of Ed. Run for your Board of Finance. It's really important to get involved at a local level. With regard to HR1, a lot of the things that are in HR1, Connecticut is already kind of doing, and if we haven't done them yet, we're definitely working towards them. We already have election day registration. We don't have automatic voter registration. However, we do have the motor vehicle you can register. Online registration is extremely popular, especially with younger people. It doesn't take a lot of time. And online registration is great because you are the one putting in the information. So therefore, you're not relying on myself, like a former registrar, to transpose a number or something like that. So it makes it the data is a lot more accurate. The other thing I want to mention is that we have numerous opportunities before Election Day to register. Mandatory registration sessions are in our laws for our registrars to follow. So there's a lot of opportunities. And if you miss all of those opportunities, obviously we still have Election Day registration. But it's nice to see that we have a national standard for states to go by. Connecticut is the no excuse absentee ballot one is one we're still looking for. We're working on that one. Early voting, we technically already have early voting, and it's always been our absentee ballot process. And I know that Senator from Mika had some concerns about the mandatory 15 days. I think that might be something that certainly is negotiable. 15 days seems like a lot of time. And I know that what happens now before COVID is we had an absentee ballot application. You have to fill out the application, which Judy mentioned, and that's our security and make sure that you are who you say you are, as well as a way for you to get a ballot before Election Day. The problem with the application is that you have to basically, because you have to sign it, you're basically, if you're only doing it because you take an early train and you can't get home at night, or if you just don't want to leave your house because you have little kids or whatever on Election Day, that you have to kind of lie to get that excuse, because the excuses are spelled out in our Constitution. And now that we have the COVID excuse, which is what we found that people didn't want to lie, nobody wants to lie, so we had to add the COVID excuse to do that. But the early voting of the absentee ballots before COVID, basically you do it in your town clerk's office, or you drop, or it gets mailed to you and you mail back to the town clerk. Now with the drop boxes available, that becomes a lot simpler. So I think some of those details can be worked out so that it's not this burden on the small towns. And I hear you about the small town burden. I was a registrar in Weston, which is a small town, shout out to Weston, but it was also one where we were small enough to work together with our town clerks to help share that burden. So I think that is a good point. But I also think there's ways that we already have some of these things in place. We just have to make them, we have to codify them, make them laws, because everything has to be in our Constitution. The other point I wanted to make about is IDs. You do have to show an ID when you go to vote. It doesn't have to be a photo ID. It could be another kind of ID. And yes, you don't have to show an ID if you're on the list, but you do have to go and stand in line and get a form done. Most people have a license, so it's not a burden. And those lists have been checked through with motor vehicle, Social Security. So if you're on that list, we're pretty sure that all we need to know is that you say who you are, is not necessarily with a photo, but just with an ID. So we have some of these things are already in place. The good news about, like I said, with HR1 is it gives states some ground standards. We have plenty of these things already in Connecticut. We also have a lot of a paper trail for our ballots, which not all states have. And that allows us to make sure that our machines are working properly and that our counts are done properly. After each election, there's an audit randomly chosen polling places have to do a hand count against the machine vote to make sure they're accurate within a certain percentage. So we do have a lot of things in Connecticut in HR1 that are in HR1 already. We certainly could use early voting days legally, and we could certainly use no excuse absentee ballots, because that's really, I think, what most people want. You know, Tuesday on election day, it's great if you want to come out and vote in person, but what if you can't for whatever reason? There should be no excuse absentee ballots. So I just wanted to make those points.
Carol, I think you're muted again.
I'm sorry. I've been trying to be quiet while Laura was speaking. Thank you so much, Laura. I saw though, Senator Formica, a question popped up for you, which what the first part of the question is whether can we use your slogan, disagree without being disagreeable?
I think we should make T-shirts about that.
Great. And then also the quote unquote 15 or whatever days should be legislated and not in an amendment that would be so difficult to change. I guess, so this person is sort of saying they prefer to have it legislated after the amendment is passed. Could you comment on that?
Well, that's the HR1, right? The 15 days is in the federal.
Yeah, HR1 has the 15.
HR1 hasn't
has
yet.
the
There are no
15.
days yet for the Connecticut.
I think we all advocated to the good congressman today that you know, it might be a bit you know, a bit over the top for some communities, and I think he heard the message, and it seemed like he was going to, you know, have a conversation about that. But that's what, you know, this HR1 is 800 and something pages long, you know, so there's got to be things in there that we can massage or change or compromise or, you know, agree to do things differently. And, you know, to your point, Laura, about people wanting to be at the table, you know, everybody should be at the table. And you know, that's how best legislation is done. You know, when I try to do that here in the state, I try to go to the particular community that we're legislating for or about, and find out what their buzzwords are, what, you know, what the conversation that they use, so that can be embedded in the legislation, so that it means what they want it to mean, so that we can help you know, craft good legislation. And I think we need to do that both in the federal level and the state level, and that's communicating with people and opening it up. And I'll just add, I live in the great borough of Niantic in the wonderful town of East Lyme, and you know, we're looking for people to want to run for office this time. It's always, as you get into March, April, and May, how are we going to fill the slots? And you know, it's a great time to step up and to volunteer and contact your local town committee, be it Republican town committee or Democrat town committee, or if you have alternative parties, you know, contact them and find out how to get involved, because that's really the only way, you know, that we're going to make effective change, is to hear from everybody, different age groups, and encourage participation.
Thank you so much. Laura, there was one question which I just saw that I've kind of missed, and I want to start with you by responding to, maybe you could respond to it, is the question was about combating voter fraud claims that are not true, and what can we do to make sure that everyone understands you know, what the level of voter fraud is, I guess, in the state. So if you could comment that.
Sure. I think kind of what we kind of just did here, right? When Senator Formica, like Judy corrected him, it wasn't ballots, it was applications. Whenever we get into this kind of, if we can correct it right there on the spot, just because not everybody understands the process. Our absentee ballot process is complicated, and it's complicated for a reason. We have an application so that we're not just scattershot ballots. That's not what we do. And those applications are carefully reviewed by the town clerk, the registrars, to make sure that that person is who they say they are. We mail it to an address that the voter says they want it mailed to, so there's no interruption. So it's kind of, we try to correct it as we go. It's difficult to do that. And unfortunately, there's a lot of things that are said that are anecdotal, that don't really have evidence, but once they're out there, it's very difficult to take back. I think in the state of Connecticut, there have been fewer than 300 filed referrals to the SEC, the Security Elections Commission, and it's an average of 7 complaints a year. And with regard to absentee ballot fraud, it's really what happens mostly are legal, eligible citizens who make mistakes. They take 2 ballots and put them in one to save time or whatever. So because our system is complicated with regard to absentee ballots, we need to make it clear and understandable. And I think COVID really helped us in that way, because so many people had never voted by absentee. They had to figure out how. And I think the league and other organizations, certainly that we worked with, tried to make it simpler so that everybody could understand it. Because if people don't understand it, they're not going to do it. They're not going to bother. So it's up to us to make those things very clear to people. And when we see something that's incorrect, that we can try to correct it with the proper information, the correct information, as quickly as possible. We also, I know in studies have shown that younger people are not as vulnerable to misinformation as older people, meaning people like myself, because they grew up with technology. They grew up with, they're not even on Facebook, but they grew up with this kind of thing, and they know how to, they're taught in schools. I know my child was taught in school how to search for information that was better than not, better to look for a .org or a .edu than a .com. So that kind of thing, I always tell people when they say something to me, especially during this past election season, when everybody was so right, I would say, well, where did you hear that? Well, I heard on Facebook. Well, did you go to the website that you got that information from to see what else they were saying? Because so much of that stuff, people don't go beyond, you hear something, you like what it says, it appeals to your own narrative, so you just kind of spread it around, as opposed to checking to make sure whether or not it's fact or fiction. So I think that's what we really have to do, is to put the right information out there in the public, so that they have more places to look for that information, so that when they hear it, they can combat it. It's definitely an uphill battle, but I think that's really what we have to do: facts versus fiction.
Thank you, Laura. Senator Formica, would you like to comment on that?
You're muted.
So sorry. Thank you, Laura.
Everybody has a turn speaking while they're muted, but no, I agree. I agree 100%. Good information needs to be out there. And, I think the biggest conversation we had about, absentee ballot fraud was in the mayoral election in Bridgeport, a year or so ago. And that came out. And I don't even know what happened at the end of that. It seemed to fizzle out. But I think you're always going to have those conversations arise. And to Laura's point, let's just get good information out there. And, everyone has a right to challenge an election if they believe something was wrong. And we all saw what happened, back in November when those conversations go way too far. And that's certainly not the right way to do it. But, challenging is good, but, getting good information and then living by that information and going by the will of the people is what we're supposed to do.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking at our clock, and I know that we should draw this to a close. Thank you again, Senator Formica, for taking the time this morning. Monday morning, it's always, get going early, but we really appreciate sincerely that you took the time to talk with us and have an opportunity to answer some questions about Connecticut voting legislation. Thank you to my colleagues, Judy Lehman and Laura Schmitz, for sharing the league's perspective, and also Laura sharing some of her perspective as a former registrar of voters. And I think we all will continue to work, and I know the League of Women Voters of Connecticut will be in the forefront as much as we can on empowering voters and defending our democracy. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful week.